All right.
Awesome. All right. Happy Monday, everybody. It is November 17th, and this is the Solid Ground live stream. I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm joined by Jennifer Friend, Christine Siefenwalk, and today we have Amy Farah Weiss with us of St. Francis Challenge. Amy and I spoke last week, and I put the video up on YouTube over the weekend. So perhaps some of you have had a chance to catch up on that conversation already. It was a really good conversation. Amy works with homeless populations and has done a lot of work for a long time, has a lot of experience understanding the pressures and the needs of these populations, and has ideas about how to improve things for everybody involved. And we got into it in our conversation. I have a much more limited understanding and experience with this issue, and I'm curious um, for everybody's experiences. Christine has also worked with homeless populations, and so that'll be really interesting to sort of hear where both of you are coming to this issue from. And it'll be interesting to hear and Jen, I don't know what your experiences are with this issue. But I'd like to hear that too. What's your impression? What have you seen? What have you worked with? Or just as a citizen, what is your impression? And I don't have a solid ground blurb memorized. We always relied on Deborah for that. But we are a peer support and discussion community. We have meetings several times a week. We have lovely members that are coming to us from all different walks of life, different areas, international, mostly US, but some international members. And we meet and have great conversations. Starting in December, something that I'm really excited about is we're going to be extending the conversation that we have on these live streams for an hour after the live streams. We're going to go members only, and we're not going to be recording or streaming that. It's just going to be an opportunity for our members to join the discussion. If we have a guest who's able to stay for that, we are going to bring our guest into the conversation so members can ask questions or give commentary and join because these discussions are always, at least for me, they're always really enriching. So
Mm-hmm.
it goes places I'm not expecting. It's really cool, and it never feels like an hour is quite enough to really get into it. So we're going to have that as an option for our members to join those discussions. So if you're interested in that and would like to join us, you can check us out on Substack. It's Solid Ground Support at Substack. And we also have a locals. It's Solid Ground on locals. So there will be links in the description for this after I get that up later this afternoon. And please come join. And hello, David Lowboy. Hello, student of rhythm. Riff Rocks, nice to see you. You've been back for a couple of weeks, looks like, but I'm glad you're back now. And Morning Cigar, hi. All Space, good to see you too. Nice to see everybody in the chat. So I want to get into asking Christine and Ames for more of their experiences, but first maybe it would be useful to just kind of get everybody's experiences. And also, I talked about mine in the previous conversation with Ames, so I won't get into it too deeply, but just to start it off, I didn't see a lot of homelessness where I came from in South Texas. Whether it was maybe not as much of an issue in the aughts as as it has become over the past 15 years, or whether it was where I lived. I mean, it's super hot. It's not very comfortable to be out on the street in a place where the temperatures are like 110 for a lot of the summer. So I don't know if that's a factor. Other things, maybe I just lived more suburban, and so I wasn't around the urban areas where you'd see a lot of this. But for whatever reason, I didn't see a lot of it in Texas. I moved to Seattle in 2009, and there was homelessness. It was in your face. And over the next 10 years that I lived in the Seattle area, it increased dramatically, at least from what I could detect and see. So it started to be that there were tents popping up in parks and along freeways. There were literal rivers of trash coming down the freeways from the tents that would just be up everywhere. People roaming around, raving and yelling and screaming. Often in downtown Seattle, you would see a lot of that. People congregating in masses, harassing passersby, just very very desperate and disheveled and dangerous seeming. And this was a bigger and bigger issue. And so I live in Spokane, Washington now. There's a ton of homelessness here too. And people, I was telling Jen the other day, there's a guy who holds up a sign panhandling saying, I'd rather beg than steal. And you see this sign, and my son and I, when we drove by this guy the first time, we had the same reaction. Well, that seems like a threat. That's a threat. You give me something or I'll take it. And that kind of sets the tone for what I see. I see a really hostile and aggressive population that is not being reined in any way. And so I want to take a compassionate view, but I want to be compassionate to everybody, including, and I think this is something that Ames does really well in the way that you talk about this, is you're compassionate not just to the homeless people, but also to the community that they're impacting. And I think that's really important. And I have come to see this as some part desperate helplessness and some part voluntary societal opt-out subculture. And I'm not really sure how much of what is what. And I think that it would make sense to find a way to help the former population without enabling the latter. And so that's my sort of like little sum up of my impression. And so perhaps before because I know Jen, Christine and Amy have a lot of experience with this. Jen, what's your experience with this?
Well, I used to work at a county mental health clinic, and we worked with a chronically mentally ill population as well as substance use disordered population. And so we did have a fair number of clients that were homeless. I wasn't specifically on a homelessness team or anything like that. I was on the behavioral outpatient team, but it was an issue that I dealt with professionally with some of my clients. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Christine, what about you? What was your experience in working with the population?
Yeah. So I worked in a couple different settings. I worked at a shelter, a transitionary. There's kind of multiple types of shelters. There's like immediate shelter housing, and then there's some transitional where you're actually waiting to get permanent housing, and you might have been approved for that, but it's not ready yet. And then there's permanent housing. So I didn't work with the emergency. I worked with sort of the people that were going to be placed, and their housing wasn't quite ready yet. So I saw clients there, and I was a clinical supervisor also. So I worked with some of the trainees and interns. And then I worked on a street team. So I eventually got assigned to work in a program where it was brand new, and we received a lot of funding from the city of Los Angeles. So I worked primarily in the Santa Monica area, which is under the city of Los Angeles umbrella. And so the street team was literally like me and several counselors, and I was leading the team out on the street in our sneakers and our jeans, talking to homeless people and trying to get them housed and trying to figure out what is standing in the way, what are the obstacles that we need to overcome in order to get them housed and placed. So I don't know if I should get into kind of all the responses now, or if that's, if you want me to talk about that yet,
Sure.
but
Yeah, maybe
I
that's a good
can.
overview. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were quite a few different responses. It's a complicated issue. It isn't as simple as like, let's build, in my experience, it's not as simple as let's build housing and then put everybody into housing and then that's the solution. We ran across people that had chronic mental illness and substance use disorders. We ran across people that didn't want to be housed because in Santa Monica, California, they were in the outdoors, the weather's temperate here. There were a lot of resources in that community for homeless people. So you could get yourself a P.O. box and a shower every day. You could get yourself 3 square meals every day and no questions asked. You didn't have to stay. You didn't really have to do anything. You could just show up. We would take care of you, and then you could go back outside. You could sleep in the park. And we had multiple clients would say, or potential clients would say, I love being outdoors. I love being here. And I love being in this community. And what really surprised me, I think, when I started working outside was how the encampments actually created their own community with a sort of their own substructure of authority, where they had kind of people at the top that were sort of overseeing. They were kind of the leaders of the encampment in a way. And one encampment in particular, each person that was a member had kind of a job. There were some that were panhandlers that would go get money for the day. There were some that collected food or whatever. There was someone who was kind of in charge of getting medical supplies if they needed them. So they had their own structure and they didn't really want to give that up. So for us to come along and say, okay, well, we want to house you. Well, that would mean a few things. It means leaving your friends behind. At this point, they had made friends, leaving your community behind. And you're not all going to necessarily get housed together. The housing that's available is Section 8 housing. We did build, which is lower income housing in lower income areas where there was a lot of drugs and violence and things like that. We did build some nicer housing in areas in Santa Monica, which is sort of an upper scale. Well, it used to be a community. It's not so much anymore. But even still, we could not guarantee that because we housed one person there, that we would be able to house everybody on that same street or all of their friends or community members together. And that was something that was incredibly important to a lot of the people that we met, is that they had wanted to stay with a community in some sense. We ran across a lot of people that, you know, were very paranoid. What are you doing here? We don't trust you. One of the things that was very surprising is that in Santa Monica, the average person, the average homeless person, had fallen out of housing on an average 5 to 6 times. That means they had been housed through a homeless housing situation, but had not been able to maintain it. So they had been through this before and were not able to maintain it for a number of reasons. Once
What
they
kind
were
of reason?
housed, yeah, once they were housed, they were left to fend for themselves. So they didn't have a social worker or anybody helping them pay their bills. Most of them had mental health disorders and coexisting substance use disorders. So they would either relapse and end up getting kicked out of their apartment or their housing. Sometimes they'd get involved again with, you know, prostitution, things that were just illegal behaviors. They would not take their medication, for example, and end up getting really ill. And we're talking about very severe, you know, disorders, schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, things that made it very impossible for them to function without being on medication. So they wouldn't be able to pay their rent. They were getting disability checks, but they weren't able, you know, their rent was maybe $200 a month or something out of their check, but they weren't able to pay it. There was nobody there that was like, hey, it's the first of the month, it's due, let's sit down together and write a check and send it to the landlord. So they would eventually get evicted. So they were either committing illegal activity or they were back, you know, in their addiction again and very ill, or they weren't able to sustain, like, even being able to buy groceries for themselves. So we'd find them on the street. We had several people that would, you know, say, I just felt claustrophobic. There was some, you know, when you're chronically homeless for 25 years, there's an adaptability that you develop to being outside and living outside. And being inside for some of those people felt you know, claustrophobic. They felt trapped. Even at the shelter, we had beds that were inside and beds that were outside, and people sometimes took the beds that were outside at the shelter because they didn't want to be indoors. So it was a very multi-layered issue. And you know, these millions of dollars in grant money that we received this one year that I was on the street team, I was just telling all of you before we got on the live stream, out of the millions of dollars that we got, the total amount of people in all of LA that were housed through this one program, not other programs, this one program I'm talking about, was about 10 or so. The amount of people that were housed in my program specifically, and I had the Santa Monica area, was one person. And I had talked with, our team had talked with 150 people. So what happened in that scenario was we also, in order to get them housed, had multiple things that we needed to do for them. We needed to get them an ID card. We needed to get them disability, so that they had some income coming in. And then we needed to get them on the Section 8 housing list, or we needed to get them on the list for the new housing that we were developing. All of those things take a couple of years to get together, minimum months. Homeless people don't necessarily stay in the same place. Their encampments get torn down, they have to move. So they have to rebuild elsewhere. So when you're trying to hunt them down to get them to their appointment at the DMV to get their ID card made, you're not necessarily going to find them or be able to stay in touch with them throughout the entire process. So, you know, Johnny may be there today, Johnny may not be there again tomorrow. We used to try to go catch them at like 4 or 5 in the morning because they were less likely to move locations that early. And we try to catch them that way. So we started our work day at night. I mean, and when it was dark still, and there was some, you know, danger involved in certain cases. So we had to be very careful. We went out in groups of 4. But we also had to be careful to not intimidate people going out in groups of 4 and approaching, you know, people that had a lot of, you know, paranoia, like, what are you doing here? Anyhow, and so there were other teams that were there to not provide housing, but just to provide resources on the ground. So people provided sack lunches to some of the people that were in the parks, and they just walked around all day and provided food. There were people that provided counseling in the park, and that's all they did was counsel. So they received some treatment that way. We had some doctors would go out in the field as well. And they would receive some of their psych medication via a shot, so they didn't have to think about taking pills. They would forget to do that. So all of these resources that were outside for them in an area where the weather was really great for most of the year, where they had a lot of resources, was not so encouraging to get housed. And the process is extremely difficult in the area in which I worked. I cannot speak for the rest of the country. I can't even speak for the rest of California. I can only speak about this particular area, which is the Los Angeles area, and what you have to do to get yourself housed. And once you get housed, how you maintain that housing. They need to be followed. You need to have social workers there helping them out the rest of the way. You can't just house them and leave them, because most of the time, if not almost 99% of the time, they have other needs that got them on the street to begin with. So that was very long. I apologize if I rambled.
I think that's really helpful.
Oh, very
No, it's a
important.
great perspective. Ames, what are your thoughts when you hear Christine describe that experience?
And to speak to what Christine just said, I do want to touch on housing first for a while at some point, and we'll get to that. But all of that information that Christine just laid out was really important, because that when I started doing the work on the streets of San Francisco in 2015, I was coming with all that information as well. That what Christine is talking about is a compassionate approach to how do we reach folks and help them get stabilized and move out of street homelessness. But we're seeing that all of these resources and all of this compassion being poured into it isn't getting us the outcomes that we want. And so I am not just a bleeding heart liberal. I am someone who is very focused on outcomes and metrics. And what are we investing and what are we getting out of that? And so when I think of the kind of movement we need right now, I've been saying this since 2015, but we need a movement of love and logic, not just one or the other. So I started out noticing homelessness, street homelessness, and I guess the focus that I have here is really on street homelessness and unsheltered homelessness. And I would recommend using that terminology when we're talking about this specific issue, because there's all different kinds of homelessness. I have experienced homelessness in my life where, you know, for 3 months, I had to leave my home because you know, not through an eviction, but just through situation. And for 3 months, I couch surfed at 3 different people's houses. So a lot of people have lived experience with homelessness. And if you have to put all of your things into a storage place and hope that you'll be able to get them out in just a matter of months and set up again, that's real too. So I just want to mention that what I'm really focused on with St. Francis Challenge is the proliferation, like Leslie said. I didn't see this amount of tents. I didn't see this amount of homelessness when I was growing up. Now, when I grew up, I was born in 77 and I was raised in San Jose, and I would go to San Francisco and be in the Tenderloin. And I spent a lot of time there because I was a young artsy kid too. And I was just always shocked at how in your face the homelessness was there. And I know that in LA, it was a similar situation back in the 90s as well. You could definitely see people living out on the streets, but it did proliferate at some point. And why I think that happened was it was a combination of it was Occupy Wall Street was part of it, and there in San Francisco there was a lot of almost, you know, it was an interesting time because I was out there too, because I was really upset about the global financial collapse and the way that the mayor of San Francisco is catering to Chase Bank at the time and displacing local businesses. And so I thought that was going awry. So I was actually focused on that before Occupy happened. And then when Occupy happened, there was this mixing of people downtown who had already been unsheltered, but then there were these tents and camps popping up. And it was actually kind of beautiful in a way, because for the first time, there was this mixing of people coming together to co-live in solutions. So I really liked certain aspects of that, but it did normalize it to a certain extent. And then there was a building boom in San Francisco where all of the margins of Soma and Mission Bay and et cetera, there hadn't been condos out there. And all of a sudden there were condos. And so the margins started moving into the middle and you couldn't escape this sort of thing. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I ended up getting a job at a transitional shelter for women. And there were about 60 women there. They would come into a bunk bed situation of 20 bunk beds. And then there were 2 to a room and 1 to a room in the same building. So it was transition within the same building. If you worked the program, I think you'd love this, Christine, that you come in, you're in a bunk bed with 40 other women, which is really hard. Imagine, you know, coming out from the street and going into that. But it was a really lovely program. It's called Jean's Place. It's part of Transition Projects in Portland. It's still there. And you would work chores. And if you worked the program, you actually got to go to 2 to a room. And then at the top story, you were paying 1/3 of your income as in a single room. So you could see the progress. And I mentioned that too, because out of the 60 or so women I was interacting with everyone, I was AmeriCorps Vista doing employment and training for the folks there. And I met with every single person there. The vast majority weren't able to get a job because they didn't have any kind of work record that was consistent. They didn't necessarily even have their GED. And so it was just Bummerville if my whole focus was to get people jobs. And so what I did was shift it, and I got involved with all these different volunteer organizations and help people build up their confidence by volunteering first, and then seeing if we could get to that point of supporting them but a lot of people, to Christine's point, had disabilities. It takes a couple years to apply to get SSDI, to get that kind of support. And most people are denied a few times. So even if you're not in a position where you can work, you're expected to work. And so that creates some challenges, and it creates this additional structure to support people in being able to get those positions when really maybe they're not suited for that, and we need to create a different kind of structure for them to succeed. And then I'll just fast forward to 2015. I actually ran for mayor of San Francisco, and one of the major issues was unsheltered homelessness. We need to put an end to this and create, structured supports so that people have options. And then I'll also mention that last year I worked for the city of Ojai. This is a really interesting story. So like around 2022 or so, in the midst of COVID, there were a lot of people in the city of Ojai, which is a pretty wealthy, small community that's near Ventura, that's close to LA. And they'd always had a homelessness situation, like probably about 50 people or so, like on and off experiencing homelessness, that were visible on the street. And then during COVID, a group of people found out about this law called Martin versus Boise, which Christine might know about. I explained it the other day. The idea was that someone named Martin was suing the city of Boise because they had told him to leave where he was, but they didn't offer shelter. And so the idea was, we can't criminalize homelessness if we don't have a place for people to go, which makes sense. But no city had enough stock of shelter or housing. And so that somewhat got abused because advocates were saying, well, unless you have enough shelter for every single person who's on the street, you can't force someone to go into shelter. And that actually got overturned by the Supreme Court. You might remember, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, that Martin versus Boise got overturned at the Supreme Court level. So cities now have more flexibility in how they deal with this. But I don't think the goal is to criminalize. I think it's to create these options for folks. And I'll just end it with this. When I was at the city of Ojai, and talking about housing first, we were getting housing first funds. And so anybody that comes in, you're not allowed to require any kind of drug testing or any kind of behavioral health appointments, or people have to be engaged in that kind of treatment. You can't require that. And so I was leading and managing a site with up to 40 people, and a large majority of people there had coexisting issues of mental health challenge and drug use. And so a big part of why I was there is because the neighbors were upset that the tent town wasn't being managed correctly. So I came in with the Resident Steward program. I worked with the community. I worked with the folks there. We got funding from the city to actually give people stipends to be resident stewards and participate. Most people did. But when I was there, it had been a wild west before I got there. And there was no one there after 3 p.m. and there's no one there on the weekends. And so it wasn't a good situation. And a lot of people there were scared, who were residents of the other residents, and people in the neighborhood were. And I tried my best to keep everybody there. That was my goal, was to keep everybody at this tent town, because the idea is if they stayed there, there's going to be a cabin village built of permanent supported housing. And so everyone there will be able to transfer. But I had to personally exit 6 people, and each one was challenging. But the challenge with Housing First was that I was able to connect them to, we got working with Ventura County Behavioral Health, so they were actually connected and we could get some services. But they wouldn't work with me as the leader of this site that was trying so hard to keep every single person there. I loved every single person there. I wanted them to stay, but their behaviors weren't allowing for that, whether it be meth, whether it be, inappropriate behaviors towards others or screaming at night or what have you, I wasn't able to get them on board. And I wasn't able to work with their workers either, because they said, well, this is HIPAA, they kept me on the outside instead of seeing me as an ally, which was interesting. And then my only recourse was to exit people to the street, because I was trying to create these packs, these treatment plans with the resident and the behavioral health person, so that, okay, I always use Johnny as an example too. Christine is my go-to for my average person. So let's say Johnny, was starting to do crack and was acting up and being really intolerable and being dangerous to people there. So I would make a referral to the behavioral health group and say, hey, we really need help, because if we don't help Johnny now, he's going to be exited. Can you work with me to come up with a plan? And I would talk to Johnny too and say, hey, I don't want to drug test you because of anything punitive. I just want to know what's really going on. Would you do that with me voluntarily? No, I won't. Okay, well, would you work with Ventura County Behavioral Health for a connection to treatment and you could come back here when you're done? No, I won't do that. Okay, I have to exit you to the street. And Leslie, when we were talking the other day, there's this idea of how do you deal with the really challenging hard luck cases that are very numerous. There's a lot of people who, if you understood their background, and this is a large majority, I would say almost over 50%, when you hear their background, you understand the glitch, you understand the tangled knot. But if the only recourse that I have is to send people to the street or to jail's really expensive, doesn't do any good. They come back out, they have the same issue. Send them to the street, they're gonna be there and have an issue. So what I was talking about is creating, and this has been my focus, I'll wrap up here, I promise, that we need a program available for people to take advantage of, because there's always this idea of, oh, they're taking advantage of this entitlement. They're just taking advantage of the system. But in America, in the United States, we really don't have a path available to people where we say, hey, you don't want to go out and get a job and be totally independent and have to figure out your housing. You actually are this middle ground group that wants to give maybe 20 hours a week, and you get all the things that you need, and you get a living stipend. And so that's what I call the Resident Steward program. And I think that should be available to any American, because there are a lot of people, especially young people, where they want that option of, I'm going to give 20 hours, I'm going to get these things, I'm in an interdependent system. In a way, it's like communism light for a group of people that are looking for that, right? But you can still be independent. You can still choose that route, and maybe you get to that route at a certain level, but that the Resident Steward program would be there, and then that we would be able to appropriately place people so that if someone's being harmful to a neighbor, maybe you give them a chance. Like for me, I always say everyone starts off with an A, like you get the chance to succeed, even whatever you've done in the past. But if you can't be a good neighbor now, there should be another place besides the street or jail that has a bit more restrictions, maybe, no overnight guests, you have to check in, you have to do all these things where your freedoms are somewhat limited. But that's because you couldn't play ball in in a co-living situation. We want to get you back there, but right now you shouldn't impact all the other neighbors that are just trying to survive and get to the stable, by placing all these housing first folks, that are coming with these extreme issues next to the little old granny who just, by a certain amount of things happening, like she lost her husband, she got, we shouldn't put people next to each other necessarily that have all those issues. And that's what a lot of people say is like, well, if you think someone should be housed, why don't you put them in your apartment? And I know that that comes with a little bit of snark, but it's actually true. Like, who would we want in our apartments? Who would we want to live next to? And there has to be some accountability for behavior because of that. And that's what I'm getting at with the structure of the resident steward program.
Well, thank you so much for laying that all out. And I think it's really helpful, that description. I'm sure Jennifer and Christine have some questions or reflections. I want to read a few chats before we get over to that response. Student of Rhythm says, I can have sympathy for providing dedicated outdoor spaces for people who choose to live that way, but city parks ain't it. And that's a really interesting idea. I really think that's interesting.
Can I respond to that real quick?
To
Leslie?
Student of Rhythm, yeah, please.
Yeah, because actually there is a program, and or was, I guess, I think it's still going on in San Diego, where a priest actually came up with an idea to designate a huge outdoor space to people who wanted to continue to be living outdoors with their tents or however they wanted to be. And that has removed a significant amount of people off the streets, off common areas, off city parks or the beaches or anywhere. And it has been extremely successful. And so I just want to kind of mention that that idea has been tried and it's been successful.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's a really interesting idea. A couple more chats here. David Lowboy says, it's a sad, unfortunate reality of the world that helping people is incredibly difficult.
Yes.
Let's see. Jay Bourne, without consequences, this only gets worse. And why California spent $24 billion to end homelessness and instead it doubled. Let's see, a couple more here. Area hermit woman, a responsible woman I know was struggling making ends meet in California, lived in her car in order to get on Section 8 15 years ago. She's 72, still on it, has changed location only once, works 20 hours a week. It's very sad. David Lowboy loves your mug, Jennifer.
That's yeah, this is a different one. This is a Leslie mug, so
Yes.
she'll have an Etsy store, so you should order some.
Yeah, thank you. And then there was a super chat from Morning Cigar. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, Morning Cigar also says, I brought a homeless man to my apartment once. He fell asleep for 24 hours and I was about to call an ambulance because he wasn't waking up. It was an extremely scary moment for me. Wow, some really, really sad and intense experiences people are describing here. Caravaggio, how much money does the homeless industry generate each year and where does the money go exactly? Is that the sort of the charity industry or the funds that are being given for homelessness?
Pocket. That's
Can I speak to that a little bit in a different way? Because in San Francisco in 2015, I was shocked, and you will be shocked when you find out how much was being spent on encampment cleanups and sweeps in San Francisco in 2015. It was over $50 million a year, not on housing people, not on sheltering people, but just playing whack-a-mole with people on the street and moving people. That is why I decided to take that on as a major issue in the mayor's race, because I felt if I had $50 million, if everyone on this group chat had a $50 million right now, I think we could do something better. I'm not saying that, that would be easy, but I wanted to do something where we could actually address the main issues. And so to Christine's point, when that space was opened up, a lot of people were off of the street now. And that's what I started in the mayor's race, was what I called SOS, safe, organized spaces. The idea was that we would create these spaces to provide structure and as an interim. But what was interesting is that the homeless community at the time, like the advocacy community, was really focused on housing first. And so they were telling me that what I was doing was a distraction in 2015, all the way up to 2020. They were saying this is a distraction to try to end street homelessness with interim shelter, because really you just need to build the housing. And so we're just going to get people stuck in this state. And you need a place to go to the bathroom, and you need a place where you can sleep, where you're not going to be attacked. And that's why we need to end street homelessness. The streets should never be the waiting room for shelter or housing. And for some reason, the advocacy community was really gung-ho on leave them alone. We just need to build housing. And until we do, you can't say anything about this. Leave them be on the
I
street.
mean, they spent millions and millions of dollars on housing in Santa Monica, this actually big, beautiful apartment building and called Step Up on Second. You can look it up on the internet. It's gorgeous. And within a year and a half to 2 years of building this and filling it with, getting people off the street, it's become a drug den. It's now the center of a huge prostitution ring going on down there. It's extremely unsafe. There's a lot of crime. I mean, and it's right in the middle of like one of the more affluent areas in Southern California. It's been completely destroyed. They basically built it and then housed these people, and then that's it. It's become a total shit show. Everyone's running amok, and it's out of control and completely crazy. So there's no, it's not just about building the space. It's actually, it needs to be managed somehow after
Yeah.
that space is built. There needs to be some
Yeah.
management around it.
And
because-
imagine, Christine, if in that building, at least 10% of the people who are living there are resident stewards and part of a
Yes.
structured program.
Yes. Yes.
That's what I'm talking
yes.
about. And then when
Yes.
I lived in the tent town in Ojai, I actually had a little trailer that I lived in, and me being on site and living there, game changer. So
Yeah.
there needs to be a few people with our experience
Yes.
living on site too. And that can be, a mixture of work and housing and
Right.
supports, but it can't just be you stick everyone here and just cross your fingers and hope for the
And
best.
that's it. And they're off the street, and that's that, because they'll go back.
They'll go back to the
It's
street,
gonna
and
go
then
right
now
back.
they'll be even harder to support.
That's
The
right.
resident steward program sounds really promising and really interesting, but the questions that I have around it, when you called it communism light, and I thought, well, it's just like optional opt-in communism, really.
That's why it's
But
light.
yeah, so a couple
not
of
forced.
thoughts that I have when you talk about that. One is I saw a documentary. This is a long time ago, and I barely remember it, but a little bit. It was about how prison worked in some country. Maybe it was the Netherlands. I don't remember, but there was this lovely sort of rehabilitation focused penal system that when someone was convicted of a crime, even a really serious crime, even like murder, instead of just being thrown away and thrown into prison, they were kept in a rehabilitation system. So their prisons were set up kind of like what you're saying, like this resident stewardship thing. People were expected to have responsibilities. They were treated with respect. They were incarcerated. Depending on the severity of their crime, they might end up back out in the world again sooner or later. But that was dependent on their moving through this rehabilitation program. But it was rehab and community focused. It sounds a lot like what you're talking about. So, I mean, a lot of what sounds like it needs to happen is prison reform. But
Mhm.
but also, how would this resident stewardship program be enforced? Would people be required to do it? Would it be in conjunction with stricter laws that say, okay, vagrancy is not allowed? We will put you in jail for panhandling, for harassing people, for loitering, for petty theft, and all these other things. Like, because if it's still just another opt-in, then what is going to prevent the worst among us from ending up back on the street, opting into a life of petty crime?
Well, one thing to consider too is that when it comes to panhandling or loitering, you're talking about First Amendment issues or issues that have to do with freedoms. So there's battles around that. You could Google that and look into, different towns trying to figure out how to address panhandling or loitering or those types of things. And they're thorny issues to address. And I think that's a good thing that that you can't do those things willy-nilly, that you have to do them within
Well,
the
what
law,
about just
but
public
it's challenging.
intoxication? I mean, that
Sure. And in San Francisco, the current mayor, Daniel Lurie, is cracking down more on public intoxication of any substance, where you're acting out, or public use of meth or fentanyl. And I think that's a good thing. What I was always saying, since 2015 with San Francisco politics, is we need to create enough safe options so that we can enforce things on the street, so we can actually have a heavier hand. But I feel first we should provide that. As a very wealthy country, we should be investing in these structures so that people have that option if they fall through the cracks. And you would want that for anyone: your brother who had schizophrenia, your mother who fell down, on some hard times. You'd want places for everyone. I think there should be places for everyone to go if they fall on hard times, but there has to be a structure to support them. And then you can be more, you can enforce more things about the state of the streets. But until we create that system, I don't think we have that option of just criminalizing, because that doesn't make sense, and it's expensive, and it doesn't get us the outcomes we want.
it's so hard, because I agree with your metaphor about the tangled knot. I mean, it is a tangled knot in so many ways. Like when you say it's a wealthy country, the first thing I do is cringe, because we're a country that's so debt riddled, and we're spending so much money on foreign wars and all kinds of stuff that's not bringing the focus back to Americans.
Yes.
Meanwhile, BlackRock and all these private equity firms have bought
Yes.
up crazy amounts of our real estate, and now they're turning us into a rental society where people are spending a ton of
Yes.
money on rents. And so when we talk about we're wealthy, so why not just throw some more of our compulsory tax money at this problem? It seems like you need to first go in and I wish the Doge thing had been more successful and more reasonable, and had really gone through what are we spending all of these tax dollars on, and then reallocate maybe.
Mhm.
But just taking more money from people who are already really stressed and stretched very thin,
Yes.
it's that gets back to that tangled knot
But if
analogy.
you're investing, I think with a resident steward program, and once again, I see this as being something for young people, and that was my heart and spirit as a young person. I went and did all these live work experiences on a farm, or a healing community, or things of that nature. And I think if we offer that to people, we have less of a chance of people getting into a challenging situation later, because you're saying you can always opt into this. And it's going to save money in the end game, I feel, because you're not dealing with the issues of people not having a place to plug in and just kind of creating their own space. And you can connect that with farm work, agricultural, all these different issues, for the 20 hours a week that people have to do. It could either be at their site, or it could be at something supporting the community. So I think there's ways to plug people in so that they're actually contributing to society and not just taking, because that's really the goal of resident stewardship, is that you get and you give, and it's very clear what those things are. However, as I was mentioning the other day, Leslie, like, it does give me pause, because if we create this whole opt-in program for people where we're saying, okay, if you do this and you get this, then those things could always change later on politically. And that could be a really undesirable situation if they take away things from you, or if people get super dependent on it and then that whole program's taken away. That's a challenge. And I just say that because I always think of the unintended consequences of these things, and how do we think ahead so that we could prevent this from being something detrimental?
I mean, I think it's really hard to kind of put everybody who's homeless um, into the same category, because I still think that there's this group of people that really don't want to be housed. And I don't say that 'cause it's what what I believe. It's because it's what I've been told by those people directly. So I think that this other, having a couple of options, I think this other option of having a space that is kind of an enclosed space that's dedicated, that's that space for them, where they can be outside. I don't think that that's a bad idea. And I think it was so successful because it attracted the people that didn't want to be housed. And the thing is, most people ended up going there that were on the streets. And I'm not saying it's right for everybody, but I think that there's got to, you have to look at the different kinds of homeless situations. The chronically homeless, for example, that have been homeless for 20, 25 years, being housed may not be what the ultimate best thing for them is. It may not be what they want to do. So we can't always go based on what we're also talking about people that have heavy mental illness in many cases. We kind of have to be the adults in the room at some point. And
So what if
take
every
some
option
sort
is institutional? What if every single option is institutional? Here's a nursing home for people who can't take care of themselves. Here's some kind of assisted living center for people who are really in this kind of
Yes.
desperate physical situation.
Yes.
Here's a prison for people who are really hell-bent on continuing to commit crimes and
Mhm.
pose a danger to
Yes.
themselves and others.
Yes.
Here's residential stewardship for people who have
Yes.
some kind of a desire for a pathway up, but
Yes.
we tighten down law enforcement when it comes to
That's
everything else. So you get your choice of
100%.
institutional options.
Sure.
I think that's 100%. I think a direction that we have to look at that would be very, very successful, in my opinion.
And when I did my interviews on the street, this was back before COVID, I got money from Facebook. One of the first Facebook employees like gave me money to do a pilot of an SOS village. And we had the site, and it was just petty politics at the time that was blocking us from that, because we had lots of heavy hitters on our side. We had the money. I was willing to do it. And I did, and they weren't letting us do it. And so I did 100 interviews with people in the Tenderloin, 99 out of 100. And these are people, and this is on our website, the SOS interviews, 99 out of 100 of the people that I talked to, and I talked to people for like 40 minutes or so. I get really in there and like think of it as an intervention in itself. 99 out of 100 said that they would participate in resident stewardship to support where they lived and be in a cabin, and they were excited about it. And these are some of the most hardcore. And I just did a project where we interviewed with a team of folks. It was sponsored by MIT's Poverty Action Lab. We did 600 interviews in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, Richmond, and Oakland. And it was about shelter preferences. And would you take, we made it hypotheticals. Would you take this option or this option? And would you choose that over where you slept last night? And what really struck me, I did 100 interviews myself in the span of 3 weeks. And what really struck me is that most people, like, I think there was just a couple that I interviewed personally that didn't say yes to something. Like, so there, and what they were saying yes to was having a private room and having a longer stay, because they didn't want to go into shelter that was congregate, because that's scary. And I understand. And I've heard a lot of things that go on in congregate shelter. So I understand the focus on like having a private locking room, having a longer stay, and having that pathway of support, so they just don't get exited to the street at the end of it. So I saw a desire, and I saw that in your comments on our talk, Leslie. Like, a lot of people don't want housing, they don't want support. And what I've seen is not that, but there is a certain percentage that are so challenging to work with because they want to just keep doing them. You know, and that's where what you're talking about, Leslie, comes in, because I feel like we need to let everyone be a team player by giving them good options. And then you find out who doesn't want to play ball, you know, like who's going to just do their own thing and be harmful.
And they may have every intention of wanting to be able to do this and wanting a certain kind of program. They want to participate, but they may not be capable. And that's, I think, the very hard part is, you know, again, as I said, being the adults in the room and being able to say and have a conversation, it's just, you're not capable of being able to follow through with that. And that is not to diminish anybody's humanity whatsoever.
Right.
But it's just to say that some people are just you know, very ill or very, you know, they have a disability that prevents them from being able to do X, Y, and Z. So they may want it. And I think that's really important, is the desire, but can they manage it? Can they actually do it? Can they follow through? Or do we have to step in and help them see that a different path is going to be more successful for them, that it's going to be more viable?
To that
Jennifer,
point, can I just say something real quick? To that point, you know, there are a lot of people, like you said, people couldn't pay their rent, and so they'll assign someone to be the one that gets their disability check sent, and then they give them the rest. And then you get this whole issue, which you can understand to a certain point, but then there's advocates saying, why are you condescending to these poor people who they should be able to get their full check and just spend the third of it towards rent? And then it's an advocacy thing for the rights of the person who isn't able to support themselves on their own right now. So there's this additional like advocacy.
I'll tell you,
so it's challenging.
I'll tell you a personal story right now. One of my uncles has had schizophrenia. It's very severe. He's never been able to live on his own. He's been medicated. Long story short, he ended up in a situation where he was in a house that he inherited from my grandparents, and his his mortgage was $200 a month out of his disability check, which was, I don't know how much, maybe 2,000, and he had no other bills really. But because nobody would step up, and again, this is, you know, unfortunate that it happened in my own family, but nobody would step up and get the disability money from him. They gave, and the hospitals and all of these mental health people were like advocating for patient rights.
Right.
He didn't pay from his disability checks. He wasn't capable of doing it. And he lost the house, and he ended up in a boarding home.
It's your right to be in dire straits. Like people want to protect your right to die on the street. I don't understand that.
Absolutely.
So I know as we're running close
agree.
to the end, I want to hear Jennifer's thoughts on all of this.
I think there's, you know, some people that have extremely severe mental illness simply cannot fend for themselves. It's important to remember this is a disorder of the brain, which is where we make our decisions from. So how can you expect that somebody with a severe disabling condition can make the same basic decisions that we make? Paying bills and all of that, or even caring completely independently for their own apartment unit is beyond the capacity of some people. And they really do need, in those cases, lifelong support. They need wraparound mental health services. They need a case manager. Often they need a case manager that can visit them in their homes, that can make sure they're getting their medications, that can make certain that those daily things are being done so that they can survive. It's kind of like with deinstitutionalization. We opened the doors, poured everybody out on the streets, and said, you know, oh, this is for your rights because these places weren't well run. But you can't, I think that's a huge mistake to do that and then replace it with a situation with zero supports, or just we don't have enough supports for people. And that was one of the biggest challenges when I was working with the severely mentally ill, is trying to get them into housing where they have the support so that they can maintain their housing, maintain their health. I mean, these medications that they're on also shorten their lifespan, often cause things like diabetes. And then it's difficult for a person without mental illness to manage diabetes. Now you've got a chronically mentally ill person trying to manage that. They need more help than what they're getting.
Yes.
And imagine if that was built in once again to supported housing and shelters where a certain percentage of people were supporting essential needs, shared agreements, and teamwork, which is what resident stewards do. And I'll just plug this as we're getting to the end, is that I'm doing a project with the city of Santa Fe right now where I'm working with 4 different sites, 2 supported shelter, 2 supported housing. And I've gotten a great response. I'm working with 15 different participants in the month of December to try this out. Like, how would this work at, in one city at their different sites? Because 90,000 people are going to get kicked off Medicaid at the end of next year because they're able-bodied working age adults in New Mexico, just New Mexico. How do we create a system that supports them, but also has them be accountable too? And so that's really what I'm working on.
Wow, it's such a huge issue, and this is fascinating, and I think that everybody has had some really profound experiences that you've shared, and this is, I feel like I'm getting such an education on this topic right now. It's a lot deeper than what you see on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as somebody who hasn't worked professionally with any homeless population, I have a citizen's perspective on this. And that involves increasing frustration with the way that this is impacting family life, cities, safety, talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
sending your kids out for bike rides, and you have to tell them that they have to watch out for
Mhm.
people on the street who are yelling, raving, stealing things. As if
Mhm.
they park their bike, that stuff is going to get stolen right out of it, or the bike is going to get stolen. And this is just a huge issue. So thank you all so much for the conversation, and thank you everybody in the chat as well for sharing as much as you have. It's wonderful. If you guys ever are watching these and these live streams, we have such intelligent and interesting people in the chat that you go back through the live chat as the conversation is going, and you get a much bigger picture of the conversation that's happening, because it's not just what's happening here on the screen, it's also happening with our people who give their thoughts. And that's part of why I want to open up the members only after stream conversation. So hopefully we'll get that going. Well, we will get that going in December. If you guys are interested, please do join us. And as we wrap up, Amy, where can people find you? When you want to go ahead and just say it for everybody who's listening?
Yeah, and I think you'll put the link there. It's St. Francis Challenge, all spelled out, SAINT Francis Challenge, who said, first do what's necessary, then do what's possible, and soon we'll be doing the impossible. So that's what we're setting out to do, the impossible, by ending street homelessness and starting this movement of resident stewardship. If anybody's in Santa Fe in your groups that is interested in being part of this, please reach out to me, because we could use some volunteers. And if Michael Schellenberger and Elon and all these other folks want to start up this resident stewardship movement with us, we've got a great crew right here that could put some insight into it. I'd love to be working on that together.
Awesome. Yes, excellent. You guys, if I never say these kind of standard YouTube-y things, but make sure to like the video if you appreciate these conversations. Do share it with people who you think would be interested. And we love getting your comments. So please, we read all the comments. Please do comment and let us know what your thoughts are. If you agree, if you disagree, if you have some nuance to add or an experience you want to add, we always appreciate that. So thank you all very, very much. And I hope you have a wonderful week. And Amy, it's a delight to speak with you and wonderful to have you on board for these conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
So great to meet you, Amy.